The Old Testament pointed us to Jesus. That's the beginning of the story. The life of Jesus, then, is the middle of the story, and the return of Jesus, which has yet to take place, is the end of the story. But it's important for us to see that it's all about Jesus, that there is great continuity in the story of the Bible. In Luke 24, as Jesus is with two men on the road to Emmaus, he has already risen from the dead, and their eyes are prevented from recognizing that it's him. They're sad because they think that Jesus was the one that would redeem Israel. Jesus asks them, was it not supposed to be this way, that the Christ would suffer before he enters into his glory? And then the text says that Jesus, from the law of Moses and from the prophets, explained to them all of the scriptures that referred to him. Later in that same chapter, Luke 24, Jesus is with the 11. Judas is gone. And Luke tells us that from the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, Jesus explained to them all of the things that he must fulfill. Remember, Jesus himself said he came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. It's all about Jesus, but the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they tell us the story of Jesus, and that's where we are, Act 4, the story of Jesus, they really fine-tune their thinking. They limit the scope of their story to one specific period in his life, and that is the last week, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Matthew, as he writes to a Jewish audience to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah, he spends 29% of his book on the last week. Mark, who emphasizes the power of Jesus to a Roman audience, spends 38% of his book on the last week. Luke spends 25% as he writes to a Gentile audience on the last week. And John spends 38% of his gospel record on the last week. There is an emphasis not just on the birth of Jesus or the fact that he grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men, or the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. All of the miracles and the teachings he performed, those are important to the story. But there is a focus on the gospel, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Even further, there is a real emphasis on the resurrection. And the reason the resurrection is so important is because without the resurrection, all that Jesus said would be meaningless. Jesus was unique, and this really pulls him apart from other people who claim to be the way to God. Jesus claimed not just to be a moral teacher, not just one that taught good proverbs. Rather, he claimed to be the source of truth. He claimed to be the way to God. He claimed himself to be God, and then he said he would die for the sins of the world, and on the third day he would raise from the dead. If Jesus did not raise from the dead, then all that he said would be meaningless. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, we're wasting our time. Our labors are in vain. We are of all men the most pitiable. Christianity is linked to a historic event. And so the story of Jesus says that event is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Peter says it this way in 1 Peter 1 and verse 3, that we've been born again unto a new hope, a living hope, because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. It is this hope that we stand ready to defend as Christians. We are to be ready to give an answer to every man, 1 Peter 3:15, concerning the hope that is in us with meekness and in fear. It is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead that justifies us, Romans 4 and verse 25. It is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead that we are reenacting in baptism when we are raised with Christ to walk in newness of life, Romans 6, verses 2 through 4. And it is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead that Peter and the apostles preached in the book of Acts. Starting with Acts 2, Peter says that Jesus was a man attested to us by signs, miracles, and wonders, that he, by the hands of lawless men, was crucified, but that he rose from the dead, that his tomb was empty, that he had a body that could not see corruption, so it was changed, that he sat at the right hand of God, and that he is now both Lord and Christ. Paul, in preaching to the Athenians in Acts 17, preached Jesus and the resurrection. Before the governor Felix in Acts 24, we learn that Paul preached Jesus and the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus and the preaching of their witnessing the resurrected Lord turned the world upside down. Or as one man said, the preaching of Jesus' resurrection turned the world right side up. Act 4 is the story of Jesus, and the emphasis, the gospel, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is a major turning point in our story. We'll see you next time.